The ice storm raged outside the shattered remains of the research station, howling like some ancient predator hungry for the warmth of life. Snow and frozen debris slammed against the weakened structure, rattling the metal walls. Inside, barely lit by the flickering emergency lights, Alec Keller struggled to keep himself and the woman beside him from freezing to death. They weren't supposed to be here. The mission had been simple: retrieve the remaining data from the abandoned station on Duran 4 and get out before the planet's infamous night cycle began. But a freak ice storm had rolled in faster than predicted, disabling their transport and cutting off all communications. Now, trapped inside the remains of a crumbling outpost with temperatures dropping by the minute, Alec knew they wouldn't last much longer. Across from him, Lieutenant Mara Hayes sat curled up against the frozen bulkhead, her breathing shallow. Her usual sharp, calculating gaze had dulled with exhaustion. Frost coated her dark lashes, and her lips had lost nearly all color. Alec cursed under his breath. The survival suits were tough, but they weren't built for this. Without power, without heat, their bodies would start shutting down soon. "We have to." Alec's voice cracked from the dry, frozen air. He cleared his throat. "We have to conserve body heat." Mara's eyes flickered toward him, her pride barely holding up against the creeping numbness overtaking her limbs. "What are you suggesting?" Alec sighed. "We huddle together. Close. As close as possible." Mara let out a weak scoff. "How romantic. Not trying to impress you, Lieutenant. Just trying to keep you alive." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, as if her body finally won the argument against her stubbornness, she shivered violently and nodded. "Fine." Alec moved closer, pulling her toward him. Her body was cold, too cold. That wasn't a good sign. Carefully, he wrapped his arms around her, pressing his warmth against her as best he could. She tensed at first, but as the heat seeped into her frozen limbs, she exhaled a shaky breath and sank into his embrace. "You're like a damn furnace," she muttered, voice barely above a whisper. "Perks of being human," Alec said. "We run hot." A small, almost bitter chuckle escaped her lips. "Never thought my life would depend on a human space cowboy." Alec smirked, even as he adjusted their position to share more warmth. "And here I thought you Navy officers were supposed to be tough." "Shut up," she murmured, her voice growing softer. Silence settled between them, broken only by the distant howling of the storm. Alec could feel her body slowly relaxing, her breathing becoming steadier. But she was still too cold. "Stay awake," he said firmly. "Tired? Don't care," he shot back. "You fall asleep like this, you might not wake up." Mara shifted slightly, her cheek pressing against his shoulder. "You always this bossy? Only when someone's trying to die on me." She let out a slow breath, and for a moment, he thought she might actually fall asleep despite his warning. Then, in a voice barely audible, she said, "Why are you really here, Keller?" Alec blinked, caught off guard. "You mean besides freezing to death? You had a cushy job on Terra," she murmured. "Why'd you take this contract? You're not a soldier, not a scientist. So why?" He hesitated. That wasn't a story he told many people. "Needed a change," he finally said. Mara hummed softly. "That's not an answer." Alec exhaled through his nose, feeling the cold sting his throat. "Lost someone. A long time ago. Couldn't sit still after that. So I signed up for deep space work. Figured if I kept moving, maybe it'd hurt less." For a while, Mara didn't respond. He thought maybe she had finally drifted off, but then she whispered, "Does it?" Alec tightened his hold around her, feeling the slow return of warmth in her body. Some days, the storm outside raged on, but inside their fragile shelter, warmth slowly fought against the cold. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for now, that was all they needed. Hours passed, though neither of them could tell exactly how many. Time felt meaningless in the numbing cold, where survival hinged on every heartbeat, every shared breath. Alec kept himself awake through sheer willpower, occasionally flexing his fingers and toes to keep the blood flowing. Mara, though still weak, was no longer shivering as violently. That was a small victory. The storm hadn't let up. The wind howled like a hungry beast, rattling the remains of the research station with bone-chilling intensity. Alec had no idea if their distress beacon had made it through the interference. If help wasn't already on the way, they were going to have to figure something else out. "You still with me, Hayes?" Alec murmured. A soft hum of acknowledgement vibrated against his chest. "Barely," she whispered. "But you're weirdly comfortable for a walking space heater." Alec smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." Mara shifted slightly, her limbs regaining enough strength to press closer against him. "Don't let it go to your head." The warmth between them was fragile, but it was working. It was the only thing keeping them alive. But it wouldn't be enough forever. Alec knew that if they didn't find an alternate heat source soon, their bodies would eventually give out. His gaze flickered to the broken emergency panel across the room. The station's main power grid was fried, but if there was still some residual energy in the backup cells, he needed to check. "Stay here," Alec said. Mara groaned. "Bad idea. Warmth, remember?" "I won't be long," he assured her. "If there's even a little juice left in that panel, I might be able to reroute it into the heating system." Mara didn't argue, but she also didn't look convinced. Alec carefully untangled himself from their shared cocoon and stood. The instant he stepped away, the cold hit him like a hammer. His breath turned to ice in the air, his body screaming in protest as warmth was stripped away. He moved quickly, crossing the small room to the damaged panel. His fingers, already stiff, pried open the metal casing, exposing a mess of frozen wires and cracked circuits. He had done plenty of jury-rigging in his time, but this was a different beast entirely. Still, he had to try. Alec worked quickly, ignoring the biting chill creeping into his bones. He stripped wires, bypassed fried components, and rerouted what little power remained. The emergency system flickered weakly, just a tiny surge of life. Then, finally, a dull hum echoed through the station, and a faint glow pulsed from the floor vents. The air didn't suddenly become warm, but it was less freezing. It was something. Alec exhaled a shaky breath and turned back toward Mara, expecting some kind of sarcastic remark about his miraculous engineering skills. But she wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing, barely, using the wall for support. "You did it," she murmured, blinking sluggishly. "Not much," Alec admitted. "But it'll keep us from turning into popsicles a little longer." Mara let out a weak chuckle. "Guess I owe you one. You can buy me a drink when we get out of here." "Deal." Alec guided her back down to the floor where the heat was faintest but most concentrated. This time, when she leaned against him, it wasn't just for survival. The storm outside was still relentless. The ice-covered planet still wanted them dead. But for now, they had a chance. And sometimes, in the cold darkness, that was all you needed. The next few hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and survival. The meager heat Alec had managed to coax from the failing system wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them both from slipping into hypothermia. Mara stirred beside him, her breathing stronger, more stable. That was a good sign. Alec, however, was running low on energy. He had burned through his own body heat to keep her warm, and it was taking its toll. "You look like hell," Mara muttered, her voice hoarse but stronger than before. Alec let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah. Well, not all of us can pull off the frostbitten war hero look." Mara smirked weakly, then frowned as she glanced at the still flickering emergency panel. "How long do you think we have?" Alec exhaled, glancing at the dim lights struggling to stay on. "Few more hours, maybe. If we're lucky." She shifted slightly, testing her strength. "We can't wait that long." He gave her a questioning look. "You planning on fighting the storm with your bare hands?" Mara rolled her eyes. "No. But we have one option left." Alec raised a brow. "I'm listening." She gestured weakly toward the back of the station. "The garage. If the storm didn't bury the entrance, there might be an old scout sled in there. It won't get us off-world, but it could get us to higher ground. Out of this dead zone. That's our best shot at getting a signal out." Alec hesitated. The thought of leaving what little warmth they had left wasn't appealing, but she wasn't wrong. If they just sat here, hoping someone would come, they were as good as dead. "All right," he said. "We go together." Mara nodded, but he could see how much effort it took for her to push herself up. He steadied her, letting her lean on him as they moved toward the back corridor. The air got colder with every step. By the time they reached the garage door, Alec could feel ice forming on the inside of his gloves. The panel beside the entrance was frozen over, the controls barely functional. "Cover me," he muttered. "I'll try to force it open." Mara raised an eyebrow. "Cover you with what, exactly? My sheer force of will?" Alec smirked. "I'd take that over a blaster some days." He pried open the control panel and got to work. His fingers, numb and slow, struggled with the frozen circuits, but he pushed through. A moment later, with a groan of protest, the heavy door lurched open, revealing a half-buried hangar filled with frost-covered equipment. And there, half-hidden under layers of ice, was their salvation. An old scout sled, intact but frozen solid. Mara let out a weak laugh. "Well, damn. Guess we are lucky." "Don't jinx it," Alec muttered as he climbed onto the sled, brushing ice off the controls. The power cells were dead, but that wasn't a deal-breaker. If he could rear out some energy from the emergency system, they might have just enough juice to get it running. "Think you can hotwire it?" Mara asked, watching him work. Alec grinned. "What do you think?" Minutes passed as he worked, his hands moving on instinct despite the cold. The sled was ancient, but it was solid. Old military tech, built to last. Finally, the console flickered to life. Alec hooped. "All right, we're in business." Mara climbed in beside him, rubbing her hands together. "Let's get the hell out of here." With a deep breath, Alec engaged the throttle. The sled lurched forward, breaking free from its frozen prison, and shot out of the hangar into the blinding storm. The wind was brutal, the cold biting, but Alec could already feel the difference. They were moving, and as long as they kept moving, they had a chance. Now, all they had to do was survive the ride. The sled roared forward, kicking up a storm of ice and snow as it blasted through the frozen wasteland. Alec gritted his teeth, hands gripping the controls tightly as the wind howled around them. Visibility was practically non-existent, just an endless white void stretching in every direction. Mara huddled close beside him, her breath fogging against the visor of her helmet. "Tell me you know where we're going." Alec smirked despite the cold biting at his face. "I always know where I'm going, even when I don't." Mara groaned. "That's not comforting." Alec checked the sled's failing navigation system. The signal was weak, but there was a rocky ridge about 10 kilometers north, higher ground. If their theory was right, they might be able to break through the interference and get a distress call out. "Hang on," he said. "Gonna try to push this thing faster." Mara barely had time to brace before Alec slammed the throttle forward. The sled jolted, its aging engine protesting before giving in to his demand. The vehicle surged ahead, slicing through the blizzard like a bullet. Minutes passed, the terrain growing rougher beneath them. The flat ice gave way to jagged outcroppings, chunks of frozen rock jutting out like the bones of a long-dead beast. The sled's stabilizers struggled to compensate, and Alec had to fight to keep them from flipping. Then, through the swirling snow, a massive shadow loomed ahead. "The ridge," Alec shouted over the wind. Mara nodded, her fingers tightening on the sled's side rail. "Let's hope we're not the only ones who see it." Alec didn't like the sound of that. "What do you?" A warning alarm cut him off. The sled's proximity sensors flared red. Something was moving in the storm. Alec barely had time to react before a massive shape burst from the snow to their left. It was alive. Towering over the sled, the creature was a nightmare of ice and muscle, its thick hide coated in frost, its many eyes glowing a deep, unnatural blue. It moved with terrifying speed for something so large, its jagged limbs slamming into the ice as it chased them. Mara swore. "Tell me that's not native." Alec cursed under his breath. "It's native now." The beast let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a screech, its breath steaming in the cold air. It was gaining on them, its massive claws tearing through the ice with every step. Alec swerved hard to the right, the sled nearly tipping as he tried to shake it. "Any bright ideas, Lieutenant?" Mara's eyes darted around. Then she spotted something. Half buried in the ice, a jagged spike of metal, likely debris from the old research station. "Head toward that wreckage," she shouted. Alec didn't ask questions. He veered toward the rusted structure, barely visible through the storm. The creature, undeterred, followed. "Whatever you're planning, do it fast," Alec yelled. Mara unstrapped herself from the sled, balancing on the frame as she reached for the emergency supply pack behind them. Alec's stomach dropped when he realized what she was doing. "You're not seriously. Just keep it steady," she barked. Alec gritted his teeth and complied. Mara pulled out a flare gun, standard issue emergency gear, but deadly enough in the right hands. She turned, bracing against the sled as she took aim. The beast lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping just inches behind them. Mara fired. The flare shot through the air, striking the creature in one of its glowing blue eyes. It screeched, rearing back as the intense heat burned against its frozen flesh. Alec took the opportunity. "Hold on." He jerked the sled hard to the right, skidding across the ice just as the creature stumbled forward, right into the jagged wreckage. The metal spikes tore into its hide, and with one final enraged roar, the beast collapsed. Snow and ice cascaded around it as it fell still. Alec didn't wait to see if it would get back up. He floored the sled toward the ridge, his pulse hammering in his ears. Mara collapsed back into her seat, panting. "That was too close." "Yeah," Alec agreed. "Remind me never to visit this rock again." Minutes later, they reached the ridge. The moment they crested the peak, the interference finally broke. Alec immediately activated his comms. "This is Keller to any nearby vessels. Emergency distress call, transmitting coordinates now. 2 survivors, low on supplies, requesting immediate evac." Static. Then, a voice crackled through the receiver. "Copy that, Keller. We see you. Hold tight. Help is on the way." Alec let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Mara, grinning. "Told you we'd make it." Mara, exhausted but smirking, nudged his shoulder. Yeah. Just don't expect me to owe you 2 drinks now." Alec chuckled, watching as the lights of an approaching ship cut through the storm. They had survived, and in the cold darkness, that was the only thing that mattered. As the rescue ship descended through the storm, its powerful floodlights cut through the swirling snow like twin suns piercing the endless white void. Alec and Mara stood side by side, exhaustion pulling at their limbs, but neither of them dared to relax just yet. The sleek, gunmetal gray dropship hovered above them, its landing thrusters melting the ice beneath as it settled onto the ridge. The side hatch hissed open, and figures in thick survival suits emerged, weapons at the ready. Alec raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, guys. We're the ones who called for a pickup." One of the rescuers, a burly man with a scar across his chin, stepped forward. His helmet's visor retracted, revealing sharp, piercing eyes. "Keller? Lieutenant Hayes?" Mara exhaled, relieved. "That's us." The man gave a sharp nod. "Captain Dorn, Ardent Dawn. We picked up your distress beacon. Lucky you sent it when you did. This storm's only getting worse." He glanced at the barely functioning scout, sled, and the wreckage of the massive ice creature behind them. "Looks like you've had one hell of a day." Alex smirked. "You have no idea." Dorn motioned to his team. "Get them aboard. Med team, check their vitals." The rescuers wasted no time. 2 medics rushed forward, draping heat blankets over Alec and Mara before guiding them toward the ship. The moment they stepped inside, the warmth hit them like a tidal wave. Alec hadn't realized how cold he truly was until his body started thawing. Mara let out a deep, contented sigh as she sank onto one of the padded benches. "I'm never leaving a heated room again," Alec chuckled, rubbing warmth back into his fingers. Seconded, the ship rumbled as it lifted off, escaping the storm's deadly grasp. Outside the viewing port, the frozen wasteland shrank beneath them, the storm continuing to rage below. Dorn sat across from them, arms crossed. "So, what the hell happened down there?" Alec exchanged a look with Mara before shrugging. "Long story short, our station got hit. Everything went to hell, and some kind of ice monster tried to eat us." Dorn raised an eyebrow. "Ice monster?" Mara smirked. "Big. Fast. Too many eyes. One of the medics whistled. Glad you made it out. Most people don't last long on that rock when things go sideways. Alec leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Yeah, well, we had an ace up our sleeve. Dorn tilted his head. Oh. Mara nudged Alec playfully. Human warmth. Apparently, it's a lifesaver. The crew chuckled, but Alec just smiled, glancing at Mara. In the end, survival hadn't come down to luck, brute force, or even technology. It had come down to something simple. A human's warmth. And, for the first time in a long while, Alec figured that was something worth holding on to. As the ardent dawn soared through the upper atmosphere, leaving the storm-ravaged planet behind, Alec finally allowed himself to breathe. The warmth inside the ship felt almost unreal after the frozen hell they had just escaped. Mara, still wrapped in her heat blanket, leaned her head back against the wall. So what happens now? Captain Dorn, who had been monitoring their ascent, turned to them. Standard protocol. We get you back to the nearest station for a full medical check. Then you file your reports, and command decides what to do with that death trap of a planet. Alec exhaled. Good. Because I am not going back there. Mara smirked. Oh, come on, Keller. You don't want to wrestle another ice monster? Alec gave her a deadpan stare. I barely wrestled the first one, and I'd like to keep my limbs, thanks. Dorn chuckled before his expression darkened slightly. That thing you ran into, it's not on any known records. If the planet's got hostiles like that, we need to flag it as high risk. Alec nodded. Yeah. You definitely want to warn the next poor souls before they think about setting foot there. A medic ran a final scan over Mara and gave a thumbs up. Vitals are stabilizing. You both should be fine after some rest. Mara stretched, wincing slightly. Rest sounds nice. Alec glanced at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes. For all her tough attitude, she had been running on sheer willpower for hours. He nudged her. Get some sleep, Lieutenant. You earned it. She raised an eyebrow. And what about you? He leaned back, smirking. I'll keep watch. Just in case you start sleepwalking and try to drag us back into a blizzard. Mara scoffed but didn't argue. Moments later, her breathing slowed as she drifted into much-needed rest. Alec let out a long breath, staring out the viewport as the vastness of space unfolded before them. For a moment, all was silent. Just the gentle hum of the ship's engines and the distant stars shining like cold diamonds. He glanced at Mara one last time, a small smile tugging at his lips. They had survived. And somehow, in that frozen wasteland, they had found something even rarer than survival. A reason to keep fighting.